Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give people a few more minutes to log on, and then we'll get started. Okay, good morning. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Lisa Toy. I'm the Sustainability Coordinator at the School District of Palm Beach County. And this is Water Wednesdays. And this student webinar series is in support of Museum on Main Street, a traveling museum exhibition from the Smithsonian. And the Museum on Main Street exhibit called WaterWays is currently on display at the Dolly Cultural Arts Center, which is in Belle Glade, Florida, until February 26th. And the exhibit is free to visit, and it was made possible by a grant from Florida Humanities with funds from the National Endowment for Humanities. And for more information about the exhibit while it's at Dolly Hand, you can visit palmbeachschools.org/waterways. And I'd like to thank our partner on this webinar series, Thompson Earth Systems Institute's Scientists in Every Florida School program. Florida teachers can request a scientist like today's expert anytime. And just as a reminder, this session will be recorded and available for future use. And now I'd like you to join me in welcoming our guest speaker for today, Sara Ayers-Rigsby. She is the Regional Director for Southeast and Southwest Centers of the Florida Public Archaeology Network, hosted by Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, Florida. And she got her master's degree she studied in the UK, and prior to her role at Florida Archaeology Network, she supervised field projects at sites throughout the Mid-Atlantic, the Midwest, and the Southeast. And she's going to tell you a little bit about her career as an archaeologist. So Sara, take it away.
Great, thank you so much. So I'm Sara Ayers-Rigsby. I'm so delighted everyone could be here with me today. And I am an archaeologist. So I'm someone who tries to understand the past through the things people leave behind. So I've been able to travel all over the United States working as an archaeologist, trying to learn those things. A little bit about me. I've always wanted to be an archaeologist ever since I was a little girl. I've never wanted to do anything else. In order to be able to be an archaeologist, I had to go to college, both for my undergraduate degree, and then I had to go to a little bit of grad school as well. And here in the United States, you have to do that in order to be able to run your own project. So if you're someone where you want to run your own project and be a boss, right? We all want to be, some people might want to be a boss. You have to have that graduate degree. So anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the archaeology of the Florida Everglades, which is one of the most unique environments in the world. So what you see here is actually a historic map of the Everglades. So this is how it used to look like before the area was drained by the canal system. So I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. We're a statewide educational organization, and we do a lot of different things. So I'm an archaeologist. What is archaeology? So here's a picture of a massive archaeological excavation. So archaeology is the study of the past through the things people leave behind. So we're looking for things like items that people might have modified. So natural items that people modified, like these shell tools that you see here in the screen on the left. And then also things like the Coca-Cola bottle. And we're trying to look at these artifacts. We're not dragons, right? We're archaeologists. So we're trying to look at these things to try and tell the story of the people who used these items. So artifacts can be incredibly old, but when we look at the Earth's history, humans have not been here for very long, right? And what do archaeologists dig, we are looking at things like, this is what's called a shell midden. So what is a midden? A midden is essentially an ancient trash pile. So this is similar to this. So archaeologists are looking for use of almost like the everyday stuff that people were looking at. So in addition to trying to figure out monuments people were building, where people were living, we're also looking a lot through people's garbage. And ancient garbage is called a midden. So it sounds like mitten for your hand, but midden with two Ds. So what can we learn from middens? So middens, just like if I looked at your trash today, middens would give me evidence for things people ate, tools people used, and when people were living and when people were occupying an area. So this is an artist illustration of an ancient village in Florida, so Mound Key here in Southwest Florida. And this again is the modern version. So there's actually archaeologists who are working on an Atari dump. So Atari is an old video game, and the company made extra games. So they essentially put them all into one big trash pile, and there are archaeologists who are actually studying this. So archaeologists can study anything from the earliest human occupation to the very recent past. So what does an archaeologist look like? So there's a lot of TV archaeologists that look kind of like this, but in the field, we tend to look a little bit more like this, or like me. So that's what we look like. That's actually what we look like in the field. So you can see we're a little bit dirtier. We don't really carry firearms into the field. So we use a lot of more like buckets and shovels and things like that. So here are some of the tools we use. So like I said, things like buckets, shovels, trowels. We have special screens. So on the top right, you see my colleague using a screen to try and find smaller artifacts in the dirt. And then we also use more modern tools. So if any of you all have ever seen a drone, we use tools like that, right? Because we're trying to get a sense of the larger area, and other tools as well. So we use modern tools too. Where does archaeology happen? So in school, you all might have learned about places like Egypt or Tikal in Guatemala, or about Petra, but archaeology also happens right here in Florida, and archaeology happens anywhere people have lived. So if you're sitting in a classroom today that happens to not be in Florida, I guarantee there's archaeology near you too. So what archaeology looks like in Florida. So we have a couple of different sites. So we have at the top left, a site in Belle Glade that I'll talk a little bit about later. And then at the bottom left, we have an archaeological site right in downtown Miami. And we also have sites all over the place, but here's what excavations actually look like. So I want to ask people, as we're thinking about the Everglades, which is what we're going to talk about today, is have you ever been to the Everglades or been in a car and ridden through the Everglades? So just kind of think about that. This is an overhead view of what it looks like. So it turns out that the Everglades didn't always exist in Florida. They're part of a relatively new phenomena. When we think about geologic time, or a really long time ago, the Everglades are new. For me, 3,000 years is pretty old. But so a long time ago, Florida used to be about twice as wide as it is now. So here's a map of what Florida used to look like 14,000 years ago, when people were first moving into Florida. So everything you see on the map that's green is what Florida looks like now. And everything on the map that is yellow is what Florida would have looked like in the past. So both the green and the yellow together. So people would have been living in a much cooler, drier environment. So at this time, there was no Everglades, and globally, sea levels were much lower, right? So If you're someone who's living in coastal Palm Beach or coastal Broward or Miami-Dade County today, if you go to the beach today, you just go and you walk in the water. But if you were living in those areas 10,000 years ago, you would have actually jumped down a cliff into the water. You would have had to cliff jump into the ocean. So that is how different sea levels were at this time. So the people who lived in Florida were moving from area to area looking for megafauna. So megafauna is, if you guys have ever seen the movie Ice Age, so they're animals like mammoth and other big animals that don't exist anymore. So here are some of the ones that were in Florida. This is one of my favorite ones to talk about. It's a giant beaver, and it would have been 4 foot high. So when we think about the life that people had here, they would have been, again, following and hunting these very big animals as they moved to different freshwater resources. And how do we know this? So we know this because we've actually excavated. So archaeologists have gone and looked at archaeological sites dating to this period. And we find not only evidence of these animals. So just like if you had a pizza for dinner one night and maybe you didn't eat the crust and you threw away the box and the crust, and I would find them in your trash, we as archaeologists find the bones and things of other animals, as well as those tools that people were using to actually look into, to actually hunt those animals. So that's what we find. So the pictures you see on the screen here are actually photos of an archaeological excavation at a site called the Cutler Fossil Site, which is in Miami-Dade County. So we actually have evidence in Miami-Dade County of people living there 10,000 years ago. So imagine how crazy and different it must have been. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the Everglades. And the Everglades is an environment that humans have modified a lot to be able to live in. So the next period after the Paleo-Indian period is called the Archaic period. So this is when the Everglades formed. And one of the important things I want you all to take away from this today is that the Everglades, it's not a swamp, it is a gentle system of different types of grass and gently flowing water. And then within that, there's what's called tree islands. So here you see an artistic rendering of people using a tree island. And here's a picture of what it looks like today. So you see all the sawgrass and everything that are in the Everglades, and then you actually see the tree islands. So tree islands were very important to life in South Florida because people were able to use that raised area to actually cook and live and hunt and do things like that. So if you see here, we have an illustration of people in a canoe, and they're traveling to this tree island, and you can see they're about to cook something tasty on the tree island, and then they have small cheeky buildings. So when we've talked to members of the Seminole tribe, who are the Native American tribe who's still living in this area, I mean, they live in modern houses and everything now, but they say traditionally when they've gone to go hunting and things like that, what happens is they pull their canoe or boat up to one side of the island, and then they'll clean the animal or clean the fish, and then they cook it at the top part of the island, and then they put the trash on the other side of the island. So on one side you have the like fish guts and stuff like that, the uncooked material, and then on the other side you have the cooked material. So one thing archaeologists do is they might talk to people, or they should talk to people who are still living in the area and talk about what kinds of practices people might have been doing for a really long time. So this is what tree islands look like from space. How cool is that, that you can see them from space? This is a satellite image, and every single light green dot and light yellow dot you see here are different types of tree islands. And this is interesting. They form a directional shape because of the way the water moves through the Everglades, through that gently flowing river of grass. So tree islands, there's a close-up of one of the tree islands. And then here's a drawing. So tree islands make life possible, right, for land animals and birds. And a lot of research focuses on the diversity of plants and animals in the Everglades. So we have 3 different types of tree islands. So you don't have to remember necessarily that there are 3 different types. Just know that they exist, and that some of the tree islands that exist, they're there year round. So no matter what the weather is, or if it's a wet year or a dry year, they consist of maybe a tree like a big oak tree, and then taper down, like you see in this illustration on the left there. So one of the interesting things about tree islands is there is a natural theory about how they were created that really emphasizes the role of bird guano or bird poop in their formation, and says that with the different formation of soils and things like that, and contrasting with the water flow, that started to create these tree islands, and they're primarily a natural phenomenon. And a lot of the models say they're not really inhabited by humans until about 2,500 years ago. So this is what's called an ecological theory, right? So it looks at the role the natural environment has and considers less the role that humans had in modifying the environment. But there's also archaeological theories about how tree islands were formed. So one of the interesting things about archaeology is it's a science. So what do you guys know about science? You have a hypothesis, right? You test out your hypothesis through an experiment, and then you can actually say whether or not something is true, right? But you have to share your results, and your experiment has to be repeatable. So in archaeology, obviously, you can't dig the same site twice. So you have to actually look at many different sites to try and see if what the results of your experiment are valid. So what archaeologists did in the Everglades was they actually used heavy construction equipment to dig into a deeper layer of the tree island. And that showed evidence that people were living in the tree islands in the Everglades for a lot longer than had been previously known. And it really changes the way we think about how people settled in Florida, and shows that we had a really large population even during really early times. So people might have been living in the Everglades 6,000, 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So it's pretty cool because archaeologists looked at what traditional science had traditionally said, developed a new hypothesis, and were actually able to test and prove their new hypothesis. So now we have a socio-ecological theory, right? That we have humans contributing to development of the tree islands. So people are doing things like adding trash and other material to actually make the tree islands bigger. So in addition to natural processes creating the tree islands, there's also human processes as well. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Everglades, here are some fun animals and different types of plants you might see that actually live in that environment. So, and a lot of these plants would have been used as food, and presumably the animals as well. So kunti has a special root that you can use as a flour for bread, and you have to process it in a very specific way. Otherwise, it can contain poison. And cabbage palms have edible hearts of palm and things like that. So people who are living in the Everglades would have been using their natural environment, right? Would have really been exploiting that natural environment and modifying it, right? So people wouldn't just wait for something to happen. People were actively changing their surroundings. So I always like to put in this slide. These are different canoes, right? That's how people would have actually been getting around in the Everglades and in Florida hundreds of years ago, or thousands of years ago. So Florida, we did not have horses. Horses were brought by the Europeans during colonial contact. So before that, people would have been reliant on other means of transportation. So because we have so much water in the environment, so in the Everglades and along the coast, people would have been using boats. And these canoes that you see here in this photo, you can actually go see them in the Florida Museum up in Tallahassee. But Florida has the most canoes of any state. So we have 420 canoes. So that is how many canoes that archaeologists have found here in the state. So when we think about human impact, it's important to think about the Everglades as people have always coexisted with the environment and then been modifying it to suit their needs. And I talked a little bit about the Seminole, and here you see a more recent historic postcard of what the Seminole would have been maybe from about 200 years ago. So you see here using canoes and things like that. So I'm going to talk really briefly. I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So what does some of these sites look like now? So these are two sites in Palm Beach County that we've actually gone out and done archaeological investigations on. So this is the Wedgeworth and the Hutchinson sites. So they're outside Belle Glade. If you wonder why there is smoke in this photo, it's because this is a sugarcane field, so they have to burn the sugar. And you can see here, two archaeologists are, and this is, they're actually excavating this site. So when you look at these photos, you say, hey, this looks really different than the tree island photos you were just showing us, Sarah. And that's because what has happened is these tree islands have been drained and then plowed over, but they still exist just below the surface of these fields. Another site that I like to talk about is the Long Key Nature Center, which is in Davie, Florida. And this is a site that's been preserved. So there's been development around it, but the site itself has been preserved by the county, so you can go visit. So if you're ever in this area, there's a boardwalk, and see this here is actually the tree island that existed. So you can actually go and see it. And I like to show, so see, this area is super developed. There's so many buildings, but here's the nature center that still exists, and where you can still go and see an actual tree island and go and walk around on it. So here are some of the photos from the tree island itself and what you might see when you go out to the park, and you can really experience what the Everglades would have looked like a couple thousand years ago, or even hundreds of years ago. So thank you all so much for being such great listeners, and I'm happy to take some questions now.
Sarah, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. That was really great. And it's so interesting to think of what life was like thousands of years ago. So thank you for that presentation. If you have any questions for Sarah, feel free to put them in the chat. I noticed someone had raised their hand earlier. So if you do have a question, please go ahead and put that in the chat. And in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to come in, we do have one question. One student would like you to explain how the land changes so much over time.
Oh, wow. That is such a fascinating and complex question. Um, so global, so the environment we have now would have existed from maybe like 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. So that 5,000 to 8,000 year period is when we got our modern climate. But the Earth's temperature actually fluctuates a little bit just through different natural processes. So like the entire Earth's temperature 10,000 years ago when people were first moving was actually much colder, and there was more ice stored in the polar ice caps. So if you all have learned about people first settling North and South America by walking over like a land bridge from Alaska and then moving into those areas, the reason people could do that then, because you can't do that now, is because there was so much more ice. So as the Earth's temperature started to gradually warm a little bit, a lot of this ice melted and changed the environment. So as the ice melted, that meant there was more water in the atmosphere, right? So that creates more rain. And those types of rain events created the Everglades and created Lake Okeechobee as well. So it's pretty crazy to think that just like a few degrees temperature difference can have such a dramatic impact on the natural environment.
Interesting. So we have a few questions that came in about animals, so I'll just kind of combine them all. What kind of animals are in the Everglades? Have you ever found dinosaur bones? And were there alligators where people lived on the tree islands?
Oh, yes. Okay. So there are a ton of alligators in the Everglades. They're usually pretty calm and they don't like to interact with people. But so one thing archaeologists find is we actually find evidence of people eating alligators. So imagine having to go in and trap and catch an alligator and then eat it. It would have been a crazy time to be alive. I guess I've had alligator nuggets, so you can still eat alligator today if you want to see what it tastes like. Dinosaurs, I've never found any dinosaurs. I'm not looking necessarily for that as an archaeologist, but I promise to let you guys know if I ever do find any.
And also, Sophia wants to know, does the Everglades flood?
So yeah, so the water temperature changes quite a bit. The water temperature, I mean the temperature too, but the environment changes quite a bit, Sophia. So that's an excellent question. So a long time ago, before we built like roads and canals through South Florida, what would happen is that Lake Okeechobee, when it rained a lot, it would actually overflow. And then all the water from Lake Okeechobee would go down, down, down through the Everglades and then would go out into the ocean. So now, because we have a really complex canal system, so it's like if you're pouring water from a watering can into your garden and you make like little rows or little canals in your garden, and that will make the water go different ways. That's kind of what we've done with the Everglades now. So now it tends not to flood, but it's because modern humans have done quite a bit to make sure that people can live in the area and can travel through the area. So good question.
Awesome. So we have a few more questions that came in. I know we're coming up to 10:30, but if you're okay with staying on
Sure.
for a few more minutes to answer some of these really awesome questions. And if you do need to log off, if you're on the webinar now, please feel free, but we'll stay on with Sara for a couple more questions. So what inspired you to be an archaeologist?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. So when, like I said, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist ever since I was a little girl, and my family would always read me books about archaeology, or I would go see museum exhibits, and I'm just fascinated by the past. And I'm really interested to learn more about stories of people from the past, because there's a lot of questions that we don't know or we can't answer. So trying to find those answers is like a goal I'm very passionate about. So thank you for the question.
Awesome. Also, some other questions we have. Where do archaeologists start to look, and how long does it usually take to find artifacts?
Oh, that's a great question. So archaeologists know how to look. We can use a couple of different ways to try and figure out where something might be. So one way we can do research is to talk to people that live in a certain area, or people might come to us and say, hey, I found something in my garden, or I found something in my backyard, and could you please come look at it? We might go to the library to do some research. We can look at historic aerials. So aerials from the past to try and see if maybe in the 1930s, an area looked different, or there was an old building there. So we actually do a lot of research before we try and figure out where to dig. And then interestingly, in the United States, before they do different projects, different construction projects like building roads and things like that, archaeologists actually have to go into the area to make sure there's nothing there before that project can be built. So sometimes we find sites that way too, because we're like, oh, there needs to be a road here. And then we're like, oh my goodness, there's an archaeological site.
Have a couple more questions from students. What is the most interesting site that you have found, and what's the most important place of the Everglades?
Oh my goodness. So I'll try and tackle most important site of the Everglades. I think there's so much that is important in the Everglades. It's hard to pick just one site because it depends on what's important to you. So is it important to know what groups of people were interacting? So is it important to know who was interacting and what kind of relationship they had? So that would be a question that's important to me. Is it what is the oldest site? So is it when are people first moving into the area? So that might be another important question that might be important to you. I think when we are talking about sites that you can actually go visit and see with your own eyeballs, I think something like the Long Key Nature Center is good, or in Lee County, there's the Randell Research Center, which is on Pine Island. So that you can actually go see. It's not the Everglades, but it's the Calusa who would have been perhaps moving through the Everglades or interacting with people in the Everglades. And that's cool because you can actually see some evidence of where and how people were living.
Awesome. So we had some questions come in, more questions about dinosaurs. And one of them is, what is the difference between archaeology and paleontology?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, I'm an archaeologist. So like I said, archaeologists are really concerned with humans and evidence for human use of an area. And paleontologists, some paleontologists study dinosaurs, but paleontologists are actually looking at the world and how it existed millions of years ago. So because humans didn't exist until several 100,000 years ago, and dinosaurs all died out millions of years ago, there's just really no overlap in that time period. So that's why they're different things. So thank you. That's a great question.
Awesome. And I think we'll take one more question, which is, how long have you been doing your job?
Oh, that's a great question. So I've actually been an archaeologist. So like I said, I went to graduate school and I finished that in 2007, and it's 2022 now. So I've been an archaeologist for 15 years. And I've been an archaeologist with the Florida Public Archaeology Network since 2016. So that is what, 6 years, almost 6 years now. So I love archaeology. I love the opportunity to learn more about the past and talk with people. So it's really my dream job. And I'm so fortunate to have had the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. And I hope you learned something about Florida.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for answering your questions. And students and teachers, thank you for asking questions and for engaging with us and with Sara during her presentation. This has been a really great presentation. So thank you again for joining us. And again, the WaterWays exhibit is on display at Dolly Hand Cultural Arts Center until February 26th. And the link is in the chat. And also remember that Florida teachers can request a scientist for free through the Scientists in Every Florida School program. And the link for that is also in the chat. So thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we will be back not next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday for another webinar. So we hope you'll join us then.